Hello all, I'm going to be running you through how to change your sights on your VP9 and VP9SK. We happen to be using a brand new VP9SK today for this example. It's going to be the same for both the VP9 and the VP9SK. Likely the same for pretty much all of the new modern HK firearms, and very, very similar to other firearms such as the M&P, which I have a lot of experience with. I'm actually an M&P armor. Got about 10 years experience working on the M&P, and I'm now transitioning my own pistols over to the HK VP series of pistols. So we're going to be upgrading my gun today. The sights I've chosen to use for this are the Trijicon HD XR night sights. And the reason I've chosen the XD version is that their standard Trijicon HD has a thick front sight post. The XR has the thinner front sight post. I prefer the thinner front sight post because it allows me the ability to pick up the front sight a little bit quicker. I know if I'm shifting off to the right or left a little bit because I have a clear picture of that front sight post and its light margins between the right and the left side of it. Trijicon is one of the top end manufacturers of sights, so you can't go wrong when picking them. They're one of the few that actually manufactures or handles the radioactive material in the sights, the teridium. And what you'll find with these sights is one of the other selling points besides the thinner front sight post is the fact that the rear sight is not heavily emphasized in its appearance. So you'll see the rear sight is rather mute in its appearance. Let me get that in there. There's no big white circles in the rear, and that's what I'm after. I'm not after my eye being drawn to the rear sight at all. I want my eye to be drawn to the front sight. So you can see the front sight here has a real nice orange outline to it. And the orange outline is sealed in there with a clear coat. Unlike if you or I were to paint the orange on ourselves, typically it gets covered up pretty easily and chips away quickly. So that's the other reason I picked these sights for this gun. I like a nice, bright front sight picture. The night sights are an added extra, but in all actuality, they disappear pretty much the instant you have any ambient light. So the second you turn on your weapon light, the second you activate your handheld light, the teridium is no longer visible. So it's not really doing its job. What you have in a night shooting situation like that is that you turn your light on, you identify your threat, and you engage them. You're not actually seeing the teridium glow. What you're seeing is the outline of the black silhouette of the lights against the lit object that you're lighting up. So whether or not you install night sights on your gun is totally up to you. There is some thought process that it is helpful in a legal manner in case it were to come up that how did you know what your pistol was pointed at in a night shooting situation. And you can back up the fact that you had a light with the fact that you had night sights. Whether or not they practically made a difference or not is irrelevant if you can sell the case as, hey, I had these as an added extra. So just keep that in mind. Overall, these are very good quality sights made by Trijicon, and you can get them from different manufacturers, and that's all going to be totally up to you as to who you get them from. My big takeaway is I like the orange ring on the front sight, I like the thinner front sight post, and I like the cocking aspect of the rear sight. What we don't want to have on a defensive pistol is a ramp sight in this manner. It just makes it more difficult to actually be able to cock your pistol one-handed, or rack your slide, however you want to refer to it. With the lip on the new Trijicons, you gain the ability of being able to hook it on your sole of your shoe, your belt, your holster. It's just an added extra, and that's the reason they put the ramp in there. The odd thing with the Trijicons is the only way to come up with the ramp here is they had to add height to the sight. So you'll find these sights are actually taller than the factory ones. And the factory sights are not necessarily bad. They're the photoluminescent sights. They overly draw my attention to the rear sight. I'm not a fan of that. They're lower profile than the Trijicon, which is a plus, but you've got nothing to rack the gun off of in a one-handed emergency type situation. And I'm just preferential with having the thinner front sight. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these from the gun. And if you've never seen sights change, we're going to walk you through that. Basically, it's very simple. A lot of people will pay a gunsmith to do it. A lot of people will buy tools. There are companies that make these great big billet aluminum sight pushing tools that are very expensive. They run about $140 for the tool. You can obviously get one of those if you're always working with the same pistol, because it's designed just for one pistol. Or you can get an assortment of tools like this where you can change sights on pretty much anything. What you're going to need is a couple of solid either brass or stainless steel punches, larger ones. You're going to need some nylon punches. These are my favorite, as opposed to using a brass punch and assuming that your brass punch is not going to mar the finish. And you can get larger ones if you need them. It's just an example of some. I'm going to have some electrical tape to cover the ends of my stainless punches. I have an inexpensive diamond honing stone or file that we're going to do the fitting with. You have the fine and a coarse. Pretty much you're only going to use the coarse. An assortment of hammers. So each hammer is going to have its own dynamic. So this is going to push very little, obviously, and you don't want to get into big swings of the hammer, because that's where you get into banging your knuckles, beating up your gun. This one's going to be a dead blow, so absolutely no bounce. This one is a little bit heavier, but it's going to have a muted hit. And of course, the carpenter's hammer or framer's hammer is going to have a nice solid hit. The other thing you need is a really sturdy bench vise. The more this thing moves around, the harder you're going to have to get those sights exactly where you need them. So you want a big vise, you want it on a heavy bench, and you're not going to be able to do this on something that rocks back and forth when you hit it a lot. You're also going to need some jaw covers. So the ones that I have basically have what is like a belted rubber finish on the outside, and they drop in, they're magnetic, so they hold a little bit. If you can get bigger ones, I would say do it. If they cover your whole jaw, that'd be helpful. The bigger, more grip you have, the better off you are. What you don't want is something like these. They're very mushy, pliable. Your slide is going to rock around in them real bad, and it's not going to work real well. So these are an example of what not to get. Obviously, you don't want anything like this, which is obviously going to mar the finish. This is aluminum. Anytime you touch aluminum to another metal finish or glass, it transfers aluminum to that and damages the finish. So I'm going to put some of this stuff aside and walk you through the basics of how we're going to do this. Okay, first things first, we're going to field strip our pistol. So standard procedure would call for us to lock the slide back, remove the magazine, verify that the gun's clear, the magazine chamber is empty. We're going to lower the slide, and we're going to go ahead and dry fire the weapon. Now we're going to work the slide to the rear a little bit to where we can release the takedown and slide that off the frame. Frame gets set aside, and we're going to take out our recoil spring, take out our barrel, and we're left with the slide just as you see here. I'm going to try to sneak in nice and close to what I'm doing. Hopefully I don't get in the way. I'm going to go ahead and line up my jaws, place my slide in here, and we're going to tighten it up. You'll notice as I tighten up, I'm actually going to tilt it a little bit. I got it tilted back so that this upper profile is leaning back against the clamp face. Otherwise, it's going to want to rock. Now, gun slides are particularly stiff, so locking it up in the vise is not going to damage it. From this point on, I'm going to take these sights out using the hardest punch I have, because the hardest punch I have gives me the most action against the sight as I can get. I'm going to go ahead and cover this with a little bit of electrical tape just to keep it from scratching outright. I'm also going to get a nice solid hammer, and I'm going to line up here. Give me a few hits. So obviously that pops out. Factory sight's not too difficult to get out on these guns. I'm going to go ahead and reposition this guy and pull out the rear. On this gun, be careful with getting the cocking assist or racking assist, whatever they want to call it, into your vise. I don't know that it would damage it or not, but it's not worth it to find out. You also have to leave enough height here that once the sight starts moving, it can slide out without being impinged upon by the vise itself. In this gun, there's nothing underneath the sight. In guns like the Smith & Wesson M&P, the drop safe plunger is actually captured by the sight being in place. So if you remove the sight, you have a spring-loaded disc that will shoot out of the top, and it's something you need to be aware of and capture. They make a tool that holds it as you proceed with removing the sight. So just something to keep in mind. If you don't know what you're getting into, look around for YouTube videos and see if somebody has done an explanation of how to remove stuff. So again, I'm trying to block this up, keep it captured real well. Give it a few hits. You'll see when it comes out, it shoots. So when you're fitting your own sight and you're trying to take it on and off, be careful of that. You want to try to capture it with your hand over the top of it so you don't shoot it off the back of the workbench, which has happened more than a few times to me. So we got our old sights removed. We're going to go into fitting our new sight. So I'm going to actually reposition you guys here. Okay, hopefully I got you somewhere there where we can see the whole thing. What I'm going to do is grab my new front and rear sight, bring them on over here. Doesn't matter which one you start with. You'll see the Trijicon is nicely machined out this hollow section on the bottom. That reduces how much work you have to do with fitting. If you have one that's flat, you're trying to remove that material all the way across for the depth that you need to remove. As you remove material from the bottom of the sight, remember this is where you can't see it at all, so you can damage the finish, you can do whatever you want to it. As you remove the material here, the sight starts sitting lower and lower and lower into the gun. As it sits lower, these angles then make it looser to fit within the gun. So the first thing you're going to do is check and see how it slides in. Is it easy to slide in? Does it get impinged upon really quick? These go in about a third of the way. The first thing that I'm going to do for fitting them is I'm going to remove the finish from the bottom. I'm going to grab my coarse side on this, which is actually very fine, and I'm going to do circular movements, checking fairly often until I get all the material or all the finish removed off the bottom. So you a little bit of finish on the front, still there. You got to kind of vary your pressure where you're pushing in order to get that all taken down. In theory here, if your stone is nice and flat, when you're complete, the bottom will be totally flat as well. All right, that pretty much cuts that. We're going to come back over. See, my rule of thumb is I want to get about halfway in just by setting it there. These guns are a little tricky, a little trickier than most, because the contact point for the dovetail of the sight is only right in the middle. And I'll point that out here in a second. If you look at this from the front, this dovetail is not straight. So most of the pressure comes in right at the front. So that can cause you to think that you're pretty close to getting it seated, and then come to find out you've got to do a lot of banging on it to get it in there. And we are about halfway there. I'm going to give it a little bit more. Now, as a backup, if you take off too much material and you pop these in and you hit them with a punch and they drive right across, and they don't seem real tight, you want to just leave them that way because they can drift under recoil. At that point, what you would do is remove the sight, clean the dovetail inside and out with a Q-tip, clean the front and the back here inside and out with a Q-tip, and then I would hose, I say hose, that's an exaggeration, I would fill the void in here all the way across and wipe a little on here with thread lock. You can use blue or red. Red is the high strength, blue is a medium strength. So you can go with either on this, and then you would drive it in place, leave it, don't shoot it for 24 or 48 hours, and let that totally dry up. That'll fill all the gaps and it'll keep it from drifting under recoil. So at some point, you're going to push on this and you're going to get it stuck. And then at that point, you get your nylon punch, which is going to protect the finish on the sight and the gun. And you're going to just punch it back out into your hand. The other thing you want to look for is, as you're taking this material off, how much room do you have before this lower section here starts running into the top of the gun? There is a point in which you'll drag the lower section of this sight across the top of the gun if you take off too much material. And this still has, a 0.5 millimeter of clearance there. So we're not in any danger right there. And we're still sitting about halfway. At some point I'm going to call it good, and I'm going to say it's time to drive it in. At that point, you can always back out if you start using too much pressure to drive that into place, because you don't want to get to the point where you get it basically stuck in place and then have to drive it out so hard that you damage the finish on the sight. One of the things I like to do is put a little thin oil in here. I use 3-in-1 just to keep it down, keep the galling down. You can dip your finger in there, wipe a little on the front and the back of the dovetail. It'll all clean off, doesn't do anything to harm the gun. If you use thread lock, in this gun it's no big deal. In the MP, you have to be cognizant of the fact that that thread lock will end up in your plunger for the drop safety, and that's going to cause you a problem. So be very cognizant of that. So I'm going to seat this one in here, push it in by hand, and then I'm going to get one of my punches, and I'm getting my small hammer. I don't want to get totally crazy with this thing and start beating the heck out of it. If I need to beat it that hard, I need to do more fitting. So if I can get this to move in some with the little hammer, I'm probably on the right track. So it looks like I am about to the point where I'm going to be satisfied with the fit. Now that's not to say that it's easy to drive in, and it's also not to say that it's easy to get the sight perfectly centered when it's that tight. Getting the sight perfectly centered becomes kind of an art, because you have to know how hard you can hit it before it pops past the center point, and now you have to hit it back the other direction. Keep in mind, if I start hitting it back the other direction, I may rock the slide back because I've got it leaned up against this side to drive that direction. When I get down to the nitty-gritty of getting it exactly fitted, I may remove the sight or the slide over and over again so I can sight down it and see how centered we are. Now on the VP series of guns, they've done us a favor and they put a detail right down the top of the slide, and that really helps in getting the whole thing centered up. So I'm looking at that in relation to the gap back here. I'm also looking at my gap right to left within the dovetail. So I got a little bit more to go. And keep in mind, if I move 1 millimeter that way, then that takes a millimeter off this side and gives me a millimeter over here. So you're moving very quickly with little movements of the slide. The trick is to be able to watch what the slide is doing and strike the punch at the same time. I'm actually going to move to a larger hammer and give me a little bit more ability to not take big swings. And I'm to the point where I need to take a look at this. I'm going to take it out and I'm going to sight down the two sides of the dovetail. And I've overdriven it a little bit. So now I'm going to pop it back in the other direction. Lean it back. And try to do little taps going back the other way. What you run into is you need these little taps to not get it to jump, but too small and it doesn't do anything. So now you're dealing with this back and forth situation until you get it just right. And you know, we're all going to be perfectionists with our guns because it's a serious matter and I want the sights in exactly how I want them. Now, you don't ever want to drift a sight to correct for a handgun's accuracy. If you have to off-center your handgun sight, you are doing something wrong as a shooter. There's just no two ways about it. I've seen people in classes that I've taught who will show up with their gun where they filed the front sight down because that gun always shoots low. And then I work with them for an hour and now their gun shoots high because they filed the front sight down. And I'm thinking, who in their right mind would file their front sight down on their gun? But people do it. People also drift their rear sight to help correct for the gun shooting right or left. These are all shooter-induced errors that have nothing to do with the sight position on the gun. This is not a rifle that you're zeroing. So learn some skills before you start mucking with your gun. At this point, we're like right there. And I could drive very small amounts. I mean, we are right there to the point that I need to eyeball it manually. I mean, when I'm talking getting it centered, I'm talking about thousandths of an inch that you're picking up on. Practical difference in shooting is probably going to be 0. Because you just don't have the ability to hold a gun that steady. Again, I'm going to sight down, looking at that ridge, and try to tell, is that lined up totally? If you guys aren't this anal retentive about it, that's fine. I really don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. I think we're there for the rear sight. So with the rear sight done, we're going to rig this back up in the same manner I had it before, tilted that way. We're going to start working on the front sight. The front sight of this gun is a little weird. It wants to angle itself out this way. So as you start seating it in and working with it, be very careful to drive it straight. So I'm going to work on the same process here. Starting with my first step, if it doesn't slide in halfway, is to remove all the finish. See how the finish is not totally even. The finish is always going to build up unevenly no matter how they want to apply it, whether it's anodizing, powder coating, or whatnot. So getting it all work down evenly is your first step. At this point, my test of did I have enough material removed basically failed, and it was too tight. You don't want to get to the point where you're really having to drive it hard, because even if you're using a soft punch, you'll start deforming your sight. The sight material is very thin, and this particular Trijicon sight, or the particular Trijicon sight for the VP series guns, seems a little soft to me compared to what else I've used in the past. You can actually hear the difference as the sight moves. It makes a different sound. We're almost there, so I'm going to get the oil off so I can get a look at that sight in relation to that upper detail on the slide. And when you're trying to see if you're all lined up, you're going to need to be careful with the shadows as well as the sheen of the slide. Look at it from both directions and see if you can get a good feel for exactly where you're sitting. That is it. So those new sights are installed. Get a good picture on that. You can see how well the front sight stands out and how muted the back is. It's either a little taller, shouldn't cause any problem for any of the holsters. And you're in there tight enough, there's no way those are going to walk around. So the remainder of what you do is just reverse your field strip, drop in your barrel, drop in your recoil spring, pull that guy back. Then you want to function test your gun. So I would typically lock it back, drop the slide, lock it back again, verify that it's empty, pull the trigger, check the reset, pull the trigger again. At that point, the gun's ready to go to the range to get checked out. Like I said, if it's not shooting straight, there's either something physically wrong with the gun or you're doing something wrong. Don't come home and start pushing your sights around.